Thanks a lot, Jean. Lovely to see you, whether you're with your camera on or off. And yeah, hello from the other side of the pond. I'm here in my little Suffolk cottage, so the east coast of England, in a very old house. It was built in 1535. And it's also evening here, which is why it's a bit dark. So I hope you can see me okay. But it's lovely to see you, and apologies for having to postpone from a couple of weeks ago. So it would be lovely just to begin to have a bit of a sense of whether any of you have any experience of mindfulness, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Feel free to put into chat if you like, you know, whether maybe you've heard of it, maybe you've done a bit, maybe you've done a lot, maybe you know nothing at all. Just feel free to put into chat whatever experience you have or haven't had. Just give me a sense of how much information I might include. Okay, so Nadia used the Headspace app, which is a very well-known mindfulness app globally now. I think millions of people use it. Thank you, Nadia. Anyone else have any experience of mindfulness, or maybe another form of meditation? Okay, thanks, Anne. Know very little and don't understand how it works. I'll do my best to explain today. It's a bit in the time we've got. It's a lot to try and do, but I'm going to do my best. So hopefully you'll come away with a bit more information and understanding. Nancy's been meditating and studying mindfulness for over 10 years. Brilliant. Would love to hear my presentation. That's great. So that's really good to know, Nancy. But I spotted your beautiful image on your screen. Okay. Margaret, meditating for 20 years. Oh, you see, you've got some people, got some experts here. Wonderful. That's so great. So a real spread of people. Feel free to keep going and putting stuff in chat if you'd like to, and I'll get going. So the idea here is that I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation. You're probably used to what I call death by PowerPoint by now with various lectures, but I'm sorry, but I will stop periodically and just let you ask questions. And I'll also leave some time if I can at the end for questions as well. And just a little bit about me. I'm very pleased to have been invited by Binny actually in the first instance. Hi, Binny. We haven't actually met properly, have we? But old family friend, and I was delighted to be invited to come and speak to you. My role is I work at Oxford University for what's known as the Oxford University Mindfulness Centre. And although it's part of it's kind of within the university, it's a separate charity. And most of our work is with the public, but we also do a lot of research as part of the Department of Psychiatry, mainly at Oxford. And my role within that is to oversee all the work we do where people who are new to mindfulness join us and do some practice and do courses with us and all manner of other things as well, including evening daily practice sessions for the public. So that's my background. So I'm going to try and cover quite a lot. So let me just quickly share my screen with you so you can see what we're doing. And forgive my croaky voice. Isn't it typical? I knew I was doing this presentation and woke up with a kind of frog in the throat, but I'll keep coughing quietly in the background. So the title here is Mindfulness, Should We Believe the Hype? And really that's come out of many years where I've realized that people who join us for training and teaching have quite an unusual idea of what mindfulness is and isn't. And that can sometimes be just, you know, how it is. And sometimes it can be a real barrier. So we're going to look at sort of the key myths and the key concerns, and also, you know, potentially some of the research evidence to support the ways in which it may be helpful. But along the way, we might drop into a little bit of mindfulness practice if you'd like to try it, but absolutely no pressure at all if you'd rather not. You can just sit and quietly wait for us to finish. So let's just do a check-in. So whether you're an old-time practitioner of mindfulness or not, I just want to invite you now to make sure that your feet are flat on the floor. Or if you're sitting on the floor, then that's fine too. But really just a sense of connection. And maybe noticing any sensations that come with that sense of connection. If you want to close your eyes, you're very welcome to, but you don't have to. But really, we're trying to sense what's in that connection between feet and floor. So maybe you're noticing a little bit of tingling, sometimes a kind of electrical activity almost in the feet, or a sense of pressure. Maybe there are certain parts of the feet that are much more in contact with the floor, that with the soft pads of the toes or the balls of the feet. Maybe the quiet contact that the heels are making with the floor. And maybe there's not particularly strong sensation at all, and that's fine too. We're just checking in with that sense of contact. And you might also notice sensations of breathing as you do this, so the sense of the body breathing in and out. And we're not trying to change the breath or control it in any way. We're just observing the sensations that go with that breathing. So that might be a sense of expanding in the belly or the chest on the in-breath. And a releasing on the out-breath. Maybe even noticing the air moving through the nostrils, maybe sort of cool air as you breathe in, and slightly warm air as you breathe out. And so imagining now if your attention, which may be on the nostrils and the nose at the moment or somewhere else, was a bit like a flashlight. Just imagining that flashlight now is kind of zooming out. So there's a sense of attention now broadening out to include a sense of the whole body sitting here. A sense of the space that the body takes up. And maybe a sense of the whole field of sensations. Maybe some are pulling at attention. Maybe there's a tightness or a tension or something maybe that feels like it needs changing or adjusting. So feeling free to do that if you'd like to. Or maybe just a broader sense of the body sitting. And when you're ready, if your eyes have been closed, just allowing them very slowly to open. Just taking in whatever is in front of you right now. Okay, thank you. So that's kind of mindfulness 101. Just a settling practice. So maybe you've come from a busy day or a busy morning and maybe there's lots going on, maybe lots of thoughts around, or a bit of a to-do list in the back of the mind, or sense of agitation, or so just allowing ourselves to kind of arrive both physically and in terms of where our attention is a way that we would often start a mindfulness session. And I'll explain why we spend so much time focusing on attention in a little while. But just a little taste there of some mindfulness if you've not done any before. So here we go. As I've already said, the Oxford Mindfulness Centre is based within the University of Oxford, but we run as a separate charity. We've been involved in research into mindfulness since about 2008, but there's an awful lot more going on out there, and I'll show you how much in a minute. Predominantly the work that's gone on in the past at Oxford has been around mindfulness and mental health. And that's still very much part of what we do. But there's been a recent expansion to include all kinds of just general population mindfulness for anybody who just wants to try some. So what I'm going to do in this session, I'm going to try and keep an eye on time. Yeah, we're okay so far. And I'm going to just explore what mindfulness is and what it isn't. Probably starting with what it isn't. I'm going to give a little bit of a historical perspective of where it originated and where it is today. I'm going to talk about the hype that's gone on around it. I'm going to share with you some research evidence, and then hopefully have a little bit of time for questions and answers. And just to let you know that I'm going to create a PDF version of this presentation so that you don't have to take notes or memorize anything. So you'll have a copy of this at the end, just in case you want to follow any information or links and things like that. Does that all sound okay? Great. So let's begin with a little Google search that I did this morning. I like to do these periodically. So I just go into Google and I do a search on the word mindfulness. And this morning in the UK, I got the following search results. Don't know if you can see that, 3,200,000,000 search results. And actually, I did the same thing this time last week, and it's already gone up by 200 million since last week. So I think we can just assume from that it's kind of out there. And I should also say, obviously, other search engines are available apart from Google. So it is definitely out there. And it has been out there, if you like, in sort of common public knowledge for a long time, but particularly, I'd say, over the last 20 years. Now, I want to check in with you about this. In the UK, there are these things called Ladybird books. You can see the little ladybird, or you call them ladybugs, don't you, I think, in the corner. Do you have anything like this in the States? No? Don't have Ladybird books? When we were younger, this is what we read to learn to read. So there'd be things like Jane and John go shopping, and there'd be nice big words, and you'd learn to read. Jane does the washing up with her mum, and John goes out digging with his dad in the garden, and all that good old-fashioned stuff. In more recent years, they've developed Ladybird books for adults, but they're comic books, they're funny books, they're meant to be humorous. So when I realized that there was a Ladybird book on mindfulness, I had to get it. And in fact, I've since been given about 6 copies by other people. So bearing in mind, this is a comedy book. It's supposed to be funny, but it just makes me laugh. So here's the Ladybird book on mindfulness. This is one page. Alison has been staring at this beautiful tree for 5 hours. She was meant to be in the office. Tomorrow she will be fired. In this way, mindfulness would have solved her work-related stress. And I'm showing it to you because obviously it's funny, but also that it kind of represents an assumption that mindfulness is about constantly going through life, walking barefoot in the grass, looking at trees for hours on end, never being bothered by anything, never being angry, upset or sad. And just to make it really clear that really isn't the case. That's really not what mindfulness is. But it stems from a more public awareness that it's there. And one of the reasons we're so familiar with it now is because of the amount of research that's been going on. So here you can see a little graph from the American Mindfulness Research Association. And if you look back in 1980, there was nothing about mindfulness really. And here we're talking about peer-reviewed, published, good quality research articles. Nothing in 1980. At the same time in 1980, a man called Jon Kabat-Zinn, we'll talk more about in a minute, was beginning to develop a mindfulness program for people with chronic pain and anxiety at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. Some of you may even have heard of him, and definitely of UMass. So nothing really until his program started to be explored in about 1984-85, and suddenly we see a few articles here, a few research studies. And by 1990, a team at Oxford in the UK was hearing about this incredible thing called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR. And they thought, ooh, now that's interesting. So he's working with chronic pain and anxiety. I wonder if there might be similar effects, beneficial effects in terms of depression. So they contacted Jon Kabat-Zinn and they said, what do you think? Could we adapt your program for our work with recurrent depression? And Jon Kabat-Zinn very kindly said, yeah, no problem. So they developed a program called Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy, partly based on MBSR, Jon Kabat-Zinn's program, and partly bringing in some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's a kind of traditional classic treatment for depression, and a very effective one. And from that point onwards, we see this massive escalation in interest in mindfulness and research relating to it. So we've only got the figures here till 2020, but in 2020, there were 1,153 published articles, research articles. That's just the published ones. There are lots out there that haven't been published. So you can see a huge increase in interest. With that has come a certain passion for it. And with that, as you can see from the Google search results, has come a lot of stuff that's very useful, very interesting, and a lot of stuff that is very misleading. And a lot of stuff where people are just trying to jump on the bandwagon, I think, a little bit. So I thought I'd start with what mindfulness isn't, just to dispel any myths. So a common myth when it comes to mindfulness is that it's a breathing exercise. Now, as you noticed when we were doing that little practice at the beginning, I invited you to notice sensations of breathing. We weren't trying to breathe in a particular way. We weren't trying to achieve any outcome from doing it. We were simply using the breath as an anchor point for attention. So somewhere for attention to rest. So when we notice that it wanders, which it does, it will do, we can bring it back to an anchor point like sensations of breathing, or you can use sensations in the feet or anywhere else in the body, or even somewhere else sometimes, but it's not a breathing exercise. Believe it or not, it's not a relaxation technique. Quite a lot of the stuff on Google is, oh, never feel anxious ever again. Find perpetual calm through mindfulness. Never get sad. Notice when the world floats past you, all that kind of thing. And although some mindfulness practice can feel calming or even relaxing, there are moments when you're doing mindfulness, and those of you who've done a lot will probably resonate with this, where it's actually rather frustrating. Because we might be sitting trying to just focus on sensations in the feet or noticing emotions or thoughts, whatever, and the mind is just all over the place, and it's very frustrating. If we're sitting for long periods of time, it can get physically quite tricky. And even just sitting in silence can sometimes have things bubble up. So although you may find it relaxing sometimes, that is not the intention of mindfulness. We don't empty our minds. We don't take them somewhere else so that we can just step away from what's going on at the moment. We actually develop skills where we can work more skillfully with what's here, because the mind is this incredible thing we've got. It's evolved to think. It's evolved to question and to plan and to reflect, and that's wonderful. Sometimes it's less helpful, and we then learn to work more skillfully with it, along with other tricky things like physical difficulty, emotional trickiness, and so on. So we don't empty our minds. It's not the same thing as yoga. We do some exercises and practices where we might try and bring more attention and awareness to movement. We might do stretching, or we do something called a body scan, which is very similar to a practice in yoga, but it's not the same thing as yoga. It's not a new fad. It's become very popular in the last 20, 30, 40 years, but it has been around for at least 2,500. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. And it's not a cure for everything and anything. Again, there's lots of very big promises out there on the internet. It is not a silver bullet. It's not, it's not going to solve your problems, and it takes practice. So whatever you hope to get from practicing mindfulness, and we call it practicing because it takes practice, you need to be aware that it takes time. And lastly, it's not something you need to do looking like this. Wouldn't it be lovely if life was like that all the time? So you don't have to sit on a beach. You don't have to have candles. You don't have to have incense burning in the background. You can. Most of the time when we're practicing mindfulness, we're sitting as we are now on chairs, sometimes on the floor. The courses that we offer, we do lots online. So you'd be in a group like this. We may sometimes use pieces of paper to illustrate what we're doing. So it's not something where you've got to take yourself off and meditate with your legs crossed and a beautiful sunset in front of you. But feel free to if that's what you'd like to do. So a little pause. Defining mindfulness. It's tricky. It's a little bit like trying to define swimming, trying to explain to someone who's never done it, swimming. So, you can give them the component parts. You move your arms like this, you move your legs like this. But the actual doing of it is what really helps you to understand it. But people have tried to define it. So here's a few little definitions. And what's important here is to notice that there's the what of mindfulness. What is it? But it's also the how you do it that's really important. That's the thing that makes it mindfulness. So I mentioned Jon Kabat-Zinn. Here's a common definition he provides. Mindfulness is paying attention. That's what we're doing. How are we doing it? On purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And it's really important to note the non-judgment, because maybe you've noticed this yourselves. An awful lot of what we're doing in our day-to-day activity is critical, self-critical, critical of others. So we're really nurturing non-judgment when we're practicing mindfulness. Another definition, Bishop et al., self-regulation of attention on immediate experience. It's a much more scientific definition here. Self-regulation. So it comes from within you, choosing where to place attention. And again, these qualities of curiosity, openness, and acceptance. So that's how we do it. And then Marla and Christella, bringing one's complete attention to present experience on a moment-by-moment basis with an attitude of acceptance and loving kindness. And it's really important that we note the how as well as the what. The what you'll see is about attention. It's about paying attention. It's about training attention. It's about choosing where to place attention. But if you don't have it with those hows, those other factors, you could be just training attention to, well, for example, you might be a sniper. You might have a gun trained on someone, assassin. You'd be very focused on placing your attention in one particular place. But are you doing it with the qualities of acceptance and loving kindness? Possibly not. So this is really key. And a lot of mindfulness now is advertised as attention training. Well, it is kind of, but it's the other qualities that really make it mindfulness. So just to illustrate why it's so important that the how part is there, if you have present moment awareness of what's going on right now, so maybe just checking in yourselves, just really noticing again that sense of feet in contact with floor, body in contact with chair, the breath coming and going. So we're bringing attention now to what's going on right now, as opposed to maybe the mind wandering off to something you've got to do later today, or maybe reflecting on something that's happened. So what we're doing right now. But if as you do that, there's a lot of high judgment, criticism, and reactivity, a very powerful kind of wanting things to be different, then what you're likely to see is more risk of depression, worry, rumination, substance use, higher blood pressure. If you have present moment awareness with low judgment and reactivity, you're more likely to see less depression, less worry, rumination, substance use, and so on, and lower blood pressure. So it's that how that we spend a lot of time practicing: kindness, non-judgment, non-reactivity. And also, it's not to say then that we don't ever, for example, say no. When you're practicing mindfulness, there might be a temptation like, I've got to be more accepting of what's going on here. I shouldn't judge what's going on here. I shouldn't be reactive. But sometimes mindfulness can give you the mental space to make a choice. So, for example, maybe there's someone engaging in something you don't think is okay. And there's a part of you thinking, I shouldn't judge them for this. It's their choice. But actually, there may be a time you just think, no, now is the time for me to say, I'm sorry, but that's not okay. That's not acceptable. And you've done it mindfully because it's not been an immediate reaction. It's been okay, this is the right choice. There's a saying about a monk who's been practicing mindfulness most of his lifetime. And he goes to his teacher and he says, "Teacher, what is the purpose of a lifetime of practicing mindfulness?" And the teacher thinks for a moment and then says, "An appropriate response." So when we're learning mindfulness, we're really trying to develop skills where we create space and notice choices that perhaps we didn't have. Choices in terms of our own thought and behavior, and in terms of how we relate to others. The broader picture of mindfulness. So you may have come across mindfulness in other contexts as well. Sometimes it's used as a word to describe a state of awareness, particular qualities: present, friendly, open, caring, curious. It's a human trait, so we all have the capacity for it. And you can cultivate it through practice. Sometimes it may be a practice in itself, something we might do what we call formal practice, where we sit or we stand or we lie down and we follow a particular practice. Other times it might be informal. It might be just bringing a bit more awareness to your day-to-day activities. So, for example, before I started practicing mindfulness on a regular basis, when my children were very little and I was working full-time, I was a teacher, and I would come home and I'd think I was being a great mum because I'd be there at their table when they were having their dinner, and I'd be there at the bath when they were having their bath, and I'd be there reading them a story at bed, and I thought, wow, I'm a great mum. And I realized, having done a little bit of mindfulness, that actually my body was there, but my mind had been somewhere completely different. I'd been planning the day ahead. I'd been reflecting on a difficult conversation I'd had at work. I'd be worrying about something that was coming up later in the week. My mind would have been anywhere apart from with my children, even to the point where I read them, bedtime stories, and they'd ask me questions about them afterwards and I couldn't answer them because I'd kind of been reading them on autopilot, if that makes sense. So it's about practicing informally, really choosing to be present for what's going on right now. And therefore, showing up for life, if you like. John Kabat-Zinn's great for quotes, but one of them is, mindfulness is being alive and knowing it, because you have turned up for what's going on right now. Mindfulness is also sometimes a toolbox, lots of practices. And it can involve all kinds of things. We've got body scans, and in the MBCT courses we run, we've got something called a breathing space. They've got different names, as well as the informal everyday activities. And what mindfulness is, a training course. So there's lots of training courses that have come out of mindfulness practice. Many of them are typically about 8 weeks long. So once a week, for anything between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, you would come together with a group of people. You would have taught sessions, practice, reflection on the practice, some little exercises, and then some home practice set for you. And it's sometimes described, the term mindfulness is used to describe a quality of behavior, usually associated with being compassionate. And a research outcome. We can now measure mindfulness in its different forms, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, I'm going to have a quick sip of water for my croaky voice. I also want to just name that sometimes people think or describe mindfulness as Buddhism by the back door. So I just want to name that elephant in the room. People very often say, isn't it just Buddhism? Well, certainly I'm aware that, certainly in the United States and to a certain extent in the UK, there's been a lot of backlash, particularly within schools, both about yoga and about mindfulness, as somehow trying to introduce a different form of religion into the classroom. Meanwhile, there's been a bit of a backlash from the Buddhist community who say actually what we're seeing in terms of mindfulness in the everyday, on Google and so on, isn't mindfulness. It's lost its intention. It's become, attention training. It's lost the really important roots of Buddhist ethos and philosophy. So there's two sides of the argument there. The question is mindfulness inherently Buddhist? Well, on the one hand, if you look, there's a particular Buddhist text called the Satipatthana Sutta, along with lots of others. And it's considered to be the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness. If anything, it's one of the clearest descriptions of the process you should go to train yourself in mindfulness. So it's very clear, and it's very structured, and it helps you to work towards this faculty of mindfulness, that with an ultimate intention of helping you to overcome suffering. And by suffering, or dukkha in Pali, in the Pali language, that can be anything from real deep emotional or physical suffering, all the way through to just being slightly irritated by something that makes your day just slightly less good. So this is the intention. So although mindfulness has been around in different forms for a very long time, I think it's most closely associated with Buddhism because of this wonderful Satipatthana Sutta and the clear instruction it provides. But it's not exclusively Buddhist. So I'm showing you a little image here, which is, there's actually this image on the wall of a wonderful centre in Dublin, in Ireland, called the Sanctuary. And the Sanctuary is run by Catholic nuns, wonderful, wonderful group of women. And it is a centre where you can learn mindfulness. And they welcome people from any, all, and no religious or spiritual background. So they've got this on the wall just to illustrate that at the heart of this is Buddhist practice, mindfulness practice, including Buddhist traditions, Shinto, Confucianism, Judaism, Sikhism, Islam, Christianity. So I thought we'd have a little go at trying to identify which of the following statements or quotes come from which tradition. Because you will find something that looks like mindfulness in almost any philosophical, spiritual, or religious tradition, going way, way back. So here's the first one. So the ... is, whatever this thing is, reveals to us what fullness of human living might be for someone who has finally woken up to all that there is. While we're not fully awake to all of reality, we're living a half-life. So waking up and becoming fully aware is the path to fullness of life. So just have a think. What does that sound like? Maybe Buddhism, maybe something else. And I would ask you to put it into chat, but I'm aware of time. So I'm just going to cut to the chase here. This is from a book called Mindfulness and Christian Spirituality, Making Space for God. So Christianity, mindfulness at the heart of Christianity. Here's another one. Deep reflection, concentration and thought, a time to focus entirely on the present, introspect and reflect on your spiritual self. What do we do before we put something into our mouths? We remember, am I meat or dairy? Everywhere we go, we're forced to be in the moment, constantly looking around and being aware of the present. Again, which tradition? Judaism. This is Rabbi Sam Frankel. The next one, we speak about being scatterbrained. We throw ourselves to the past, often clinging to the past and trauma, or we hurl ourselves towards the future, attaching ourselves to a hope for the future, or fear of losing something. We're in the past or in the future, everywhere but here. So I'm going to drop down just to the last little bit. This starts with a mindfulness, with an awareness of the breath. When we monitor our breath, simply observe the breath entering into the heart, emerge from the breath, our breathing slows down. The heart rate slows down. Here is where we become whole. Our body, our breath, our spirit become one. Islam. So this is Omid Safi, Director of Duke University's Islamic Studies Center. And I think this is the last one. If you don't get what you want, you suffer. If you get what you don't want, you suffer. Even when you get exactly what you want, you still suffer because you can't hold on to it forever. Your mind is your predicament. It wants to be free of change, free of pain, free of the obligations of life and death. But change is law, and no amount of pretending will alter that reality. And this is Socrates. So Greek philosophers, many of them write in terms of this thing that we might call mindfulness today. So it's there, it's a seed that's sown through lots of different traditions, very clearly marked out as a kind of course of practice, if you like, within Buddhist text, but it's not exclusively Buddhist. And certainly in modern day, what we're looking at is a form of mindfulness that has become very secular. So I mentioned Jon Kabat-Zinn, born in New York, originally a molecular biologist, studying medicine, goes on to study medicine, and developed a stress reduction clinic at the center of the Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare and Society in the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. So he was there. Now, he was a long-term meditator. He'd started meditating as a result of his experiences in Vietnam, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to make sense of the world around him. So he'd been doing meditation for ages. And at the stress clinic, he was noticing that there were lots of people there, especially people with chronic pain and associated anxiety, who were being put through various traditional treatments, medicine, surgery, counseling, but still not getting better. And he suddenly thought one day, I wonder if mindfulness can help. So in 1979, he had this moment. He was actually on a retreat. And he had this moment of realization. He thought, that's what I've got to do. I've got to try and translate what I understand mindfulness can do into a form that is accessible for everybody, and particularly the group of people I'm working with. And from that was born Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, an 8-week program, about 2.5 hours a session. And he wrote about developing this program in a book called Full Catastrophe Living. And from there, nobody looked back, really, because it proved to be incredibly powerful. It didn't, for example, cure people's pain. The pain was always going to be there. But what he was working with is their relationship to the pain. Very often when we're experiencing pain, whether it's physical or emotional, mental, is that we either hang on to it and try and control it, or we try and push it away and prevent it from kind of having an impact on us, both of which doesn't ever really result in the pain going away. And as a result, we get exhausted by it. So I've just described this thing we call reactivity, wanting this to not be this way or wanting it to be kind of controlled. So from there, all manner of other mindfulness-based programs developed. So I mentioned about this team in Oxford who were working with people with depression. They developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression based on John Kabat-Zinn's MBSR program with some CBT as well. And very quickly it became clear that this program was proving very effective. So you see here, it's for people with recurrent depression. 3 or more previous episodes made up more than 75% of the patients they studied, and MBCT almost halved the relapse rate. And it was particularly powerful for people who had very severe recurrent issues. And that's now available on the National Health Service here in the UK. So you can actually get MBCT for depression. And from there, all kinds of self-help books that have evolved as well. And since then, we've had all kinds of other stuff developing. So there's now mindfulness programs for things like eating disorders and weight concerns, mindfulness for chronic pain and health, cancer, mindfulness for pregnancy and childbirth, teen anxiety, and more and more and more. So it's really being applied in lots of different ways. And perhaps one of the most well-known works and books is called Mindfulness: Finding Peace in a Frantic World. And this was written by Mark Williams, who was one of the team who developed MBCT. He's also my teacher. And it's what he calls mindfulness for the working well. So if you don't know anything about mindfulness and you want to dip your toes in a little bit of mindfulness, I'd really recommend this book. I haven't got any kind of commission here. It's just a really, really good book. And it comes with some recordings of guided practices you can try. Very accessible and really explains everything really clearly. So along all this kind of research, there's been a definite kind of scientific emphasis, the importance of a scientific attitude in all that's done in terms of mindfulness. And that's so that we can really pull apart the positive hype. You know, are people over promising on what mindfulness can do? The negative hype, is it really emptying the mind? Is it really trying to make us go all soft and not question things? Is it really Buddhism by the back door? And any public concerns there might be. In lots and lots and lots of covers of the Time magazine with mindfulness as the title. Public concerns, they include, you know, can mindfulness harm us? So firstly to say, I mentioned about people thinking it's about relaxation and being calm. So quite a bit of backlash has been around the fact that when people finally do sit down and join a mindfulness group, that very quickly they realize they don't feel particularly calm, or they don't feel calm all the time, or actually there might be some difficulty that's becoming much more noticeable to them that perhaps they'd been not noticing previously. So they may report that. Also, we know that there are some people for whom the research that's been done has been focusing on one thing exclusively without focusing on others. So for example, in the workplace, an awful lot of the research has been around productivity, how quickly people work, how efficiently people work. So in the New York Times a few years back, there was a piece about a study that was done on the workplace where people have been given an 8-week mindfulness program. And quickly they realized that the work rate slowed down. What they didn't record was that the accuracy of the work increased. So there was a kind of balancing out, but because they focused on one aspect of it, they didn't necessarily realize the other benefits as well. Having said all of that, we know that there are some people who should not be doing mindfulness, and that to do it can also create problems for them. So the research here is really about generally speaking, there's been all kinds of research into this recently, about 8% of people who practice mindfulness and also other forms of meditation may have a negative experience. Maybe they get distressed, they get more anxious, or their symptoms are exacerbated. When you compare that to general forms of psychotherapy, you'll notice that actually up to 10% of people may have an adverse effect when they're having psychotherapy. So although 8% isn't great, it's not more than what people might experience if they're having some form of psychotherapy, statistically speaking anyway. But indeed, the kind of people, the kind of experiences that we contraindicate against are people who've experienced recent or extended trauma, although there is some wonderful work going on around trauma-sensitive mindfulness. But we always screen people who want to come any of our courses and check for things like recent or extended trauma. Recent bereavement can also be present difficulties. Ongoing or recent experience of psychosis, suicidal ideation, so considering suicide or other severe mental illness. We would say just don't go there now. Don't go to mindfulness now. Maybe come back when things have settled for you, but not now. And there is a great article on this on our website, so I'll make sure that link is in the PowerPoint presentation for you when you get it. So when we're responding to hype and public concern, we just have to make sure that we have a sound sense of the theory that underlines mindfulness, that the science that's going on is good quality science, that the training is professionally done, that the people who are doing it are trained well, that the communication around mindfulness is ethical. In other words, not making false promises, and taking the long view. So understanding that this takes time, that mindfulness takes time for you to see any benefits, and that people have to realize that when they go into it. So really quickly, I'm going to whiz through this because you'll have it to read if you're interested. Are mindfulness-based programs, MPBs and BPs, effective? There have been lots of different, very robust research studies done on mindfulness. The ones that are kind of thought to be the gold standard are what are called RCTs, randomized controlled trials, but lots of other studies are also very helpful. Early on in the kind of secular mindfulness training programs, people turned to long-term mindfulness practitioners to see what effects that mindfulness meditation had on the brain. And we were very lucky to be able to kind of bring on board the likes of Mathieu Ricard, who's a Buddhist monk who's had a lifetime of mindfulness practice, and observe his brain. And he's done lots of wonderful work with Ricky Davidson. Maybe some of you have heard of him. So functional MRI scanning, brain scanning has really made incredible leaps and bounds in terms of our understanding, including the fact that even, there's lots of complicated diagrams here, but basically comparing groups of people who've done an 8-week course with people who've had no or little experience of mindfulness, and looking at what happens to the structure and function of the brain. And what they see in an 8-week program person is significant changes in areas of the brain associated with anxiety, of the ability to tune into their own experience and read the experience of other people, and also a calming down of an area of the brain that is very focused on self-reference. It's one that kicks in when we've got a little bit of mental space, and that's when all the self-critical thoughts come in, or the critical thoughts of other people. And what we see in that area of the brain, which is also associated with mind wandering, is a calming down and more space, which is very consistent with what people have said in terms of their own experience of mindfulness practice. In terms of depressive relapse, we've already seen very effective in terms of people with extreme or worst case recurrence, slightly better than medication and psychoeducation in the treatment of recurrent depression. And in terms of other clinical groups, non-clinical groups, just in terms of mental well-being, we know that generally speaking, mindfulness-based programs and compassion-based training have a significant impact on mental well-being generally, both in clinical and general populations, that they are advantageous, the mindfulness programs, seems slightly better than what we'd call positive psychology programs for general population. Positive psychology programs generally seem better than mindfulness-based programs for people with physical illness. And that the higher the intensity, the better the outcomes. So doing 1 or 2 sessions and leaving it at that probably isn't going to have a big effect. But doing a program over an extended period of time definitely has more benefit. And just as a broad sense of how the research is moving, this is the most recent major meta-analysis of research evidence for non-clinical populations, the general public. And consistent evidence is that when well taught, over a prolonged period of time, we see significant reductions in rumination, worry, stress, general distress, depression, anxiety, and significant improvements in well-being and quality of life. So I'm going to whiz through this. Same in workplace populations, reduction in stress, anxiety, distress, burnout, increase in health, job performance, compassion, empathy, mindfulness, and well-being when taught well and when researched well and objectively. And what is it that's making these changes? Well, we think it's partly attention and awareness training. The non-judgment is really important. Reduction in cognitive and emotional reactivity, that pushing away, that wanting to hang on, and self-compassion. But most of all, and I'm going to end on this point and then just leave a little bit of time for questions, rumination and worry. So I just want to name the fact that we as human beings are great worriers. Does that resonate with you? Does that sound familiar? Unlike other mammals, we have a superb capacity for worry. In fact, Rick Hanson, not Ricky Davidson, has a great quote here. As far as we know, only humans worry about the future, regret the past, and blame ourselves for the present. So, for example, there's an antelope out there on the savannah, a mammal, similar kind of stress response system to human beings. And let's say that one of the herd sees a lion, their predator, out of the corner of its eye. And so it sends up a signal. They all have a stress response and they run because they're flight animals. They run, they run, they run. Maybe one of them gets caught by the lion and the rest of them keep running until they feel safe. And then they stop. And what's the next thing they do? They shake themselves off. They kind of dispel all the tension in their body. And then they carry on eating. What they don't do is stand around in a group going, oh my God, did you see that? That could have been me. Why didn't we see that coming? What if it happens again? But surely there must be another way we can deal with this. What about him? What about his family? They don't replay and relive the experience. And of course, when we replay something in our mind, the body still has a stress response as if it's really happening, because we haven't evolved to be able to distinguish between thought stressors and real stressors. So one of the things that I found particularly helpful with mindfulness that has really changed my experience of life is the capacity to move from something called thinking mode into sensing mode. So just to be clear, we're not saying thinking is wrong. We are brilliant thinkers. But when we're noticing that thinking, which is our natural response to a stressor, is actually making things worse, because we're thinking about it all the time. We can't stop thinking about it. We wake up in the middle of the night and we keep thinking about it. And we think and we think and we think. Then one simple thing you can learn to do with mindfulness to begin with is to move out of thinking mode and into sensing mode. And we do this exactly in the way that we did at the beginning of this session. And this is what we start with mindfulness training, is noticing when the thinking is helpful and noticing when it's not so helpful. And when it's not so helpful, creating space through dropping into sensations in the body. And once we've got that space, then we can begin to look at choices we might have around how we relate to the thinking, about how we might want to respond differently to it, And then also the difficulty that might come up with physical pain, emotional pain, and start to work with that as well. But it all starts with noticing what's going on, what's happening right now. And that's where that present moment awareness comes in. I think that's enough talking from me. And I haven't left very much time at all for questions. But please do feel free. I don't know whether you want to unmute or whether you want to put something in chat. Any questions at all? Or feel free to just, remain there for a moment. Okay, talk a little more about the meaning of sensing. Okay, thanks, Ruth. That's a really good question. So let's take our hands. So maybe just noticing your hands wherever they are right now. And maybe noticing the weight of the hands. So if your hands are resting in the lap. And tuning into the contact that the hands are having with the lap or the arms of your chair. And with this torchlight of attention idea, maybe zooming in close. So maybe the sensations there are of pressure, temperature, maybe there's some warmth. And also the hands are very alive, so maybe you're noticing some tingling sensation in the tips of the fingers. Or a cooler sensation on the skin as the air moves across it. And that's what we mean by sensing, as opposed to maybe thinking about the hands. Oh yes, there are hands there, I've got hands, great. But really sensing into them. And what you might find with that, depending on what's there, is also a sense of things just slowing down a little on the thinking front. Did you notice that a little bit? Yeah. So does that help? That's what I mean by sensing. Okay. And Margaret, just very quickly, and some meditants are shown to have significant changes in their brains and white matter. Yeah. So I mentioned it briefly, and there's a lot of there's a link to some of the research around this in the documents I'll share. But generally speaking, parts of the brain associated with the stress response and reactivity, there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the cell density there decreases. So there's less density there in the brain, in those parts of the body, that part of the brain, the amygdala. There's a part of the brain called the insula, which is around reading your own sense of how you are in yourself and how you read it in others. It's also linked to memory, and that gets denser with mindfulness practice. And then there are other parts of the brain. There's something called the default mode network, which kind of sits around here. That's the part of the brain that gets really busy with lots of self-criticism when left to its own devices. That too slows down when you do extended periods of mindfulness practice. So it's about kind of what the research is reading is activity, but also density within those parts of the brain, that then reflect not just kind of a general feeling of well-being, but actual reasons why we might be feeling better. But I'm aware of time, and do follow the links in the handout that I'll send through. There's loads of research evidence and more information. And just go, Ricky Davidson, who I mentioned, has done some wonderful TED Talks on this stuff. So if you like TED Talks, just go to Richard Davidson, and he's done about 3 or 4 of them, and he'll explain more about this as well. Okay. I'm aware we've run over. Sorry, James.
No worries. Thank you very much. I definitely thoroughly enjoyed that. It's a topic I feel like I knew a very surface level about, but there's just so much depth and understanding behind it. But I just want to say thank you for taking the time, especially for talking from so far away. And we can keep it running for a second if anyone has any last thoughts, but I do definitely want to just say thank you for taking the time to chat with the village.
Thank you. You've been very well behaved.